Hi, I'm Old Norse Specialist Dr. Jackson Crawford. Today, in my Patreon-supported YouTube channel about Norse language, myth, runes, etc., I want to talk about Thor's home, a place that there probably were solid old traditions about that we have just the tiniest traces of in our main surviving written sources of Norse mythology, the poems of the Poetic Edda and Snorri Sturluson's book, the Prose Edda. Now, as I talk about often in my books, in my videos, even in the class on Norse mythology that I recorded for the Great Courses, there's so many places in Norse mythology where it seems like possibly there wasn't that much of a tradition in story about it even at the time, right? That even in, say, the late Viking Age, when probably most of the traditions in the Eddas were composed orally, there wasn't like that much of a story about it. So, for example, people ask about, who is this dwarf Þrúðvangar who's mentioned in Hávamál one time? Well, that is the one time he's ever mentioned, and I don't think that there's necessarily that there ever necessarily was some kind of body of story about who Þrúðvangar was. It's a little bit different with the homes of the gods. In the poem Grímnismál in the Poetic Edda, Odin, while he is recovering from being tortured, starts going into what seems like a vision in which he sees and describes different places in the Norse mythic cosmos. This poem is often confused with the poem that's right next to it in the Poetic Edda called Vafthrûdnismál. In Vafthrûdnismál, Odin seems to see forward and backwards in time, whereas in Grímnismál he seems to see different places. Now, he describes homes for most of the gods and goddesses. Of course, who exactly is included in this list is going to vary from poem to poem. There seems to have not been, one stable count of who all the main ones were. And notably, unsurprisingly, the gods and goddesses have homes that alliterate with their names, right? Old Norse poetry is fundamentally alliterative, right? We think of poetry as fundamentally rhyming, often in modern English, right? Roses are red, violets are blue, inside I'm dead, and so are you. But Old Norse poetry favors alliteration, as you can hear in the famous 77th stanza of Hávamál. Døyr fe, døya frændur, døyr sjálfrit sama. Ek veit ein at aldrei døyr, dómarum dauðan hver. Right? We have lines that contain words that are emphasized on syllables that start with the same consonant or that start with vowels, because any vowel alliterates with any other vowel. So, for example, we hear that Heimdallr lives at Himinbjörg, that Froya lives at Þrúðvangar, that Njörður lives at Nóatún, that Odin lives at Valhall, right? Usually anglicized as Valhalla. Now, that may not initially seem like it alliterates, but Odin comes from an earlier Woðanas, in fact, a name that's attested in Elder Futhark runic inscriptions. So we know not just on the basis of linguistic evidence, but also from real writing that this is the earlier form of his name. Old Norse consistently loses a W, later V, before an O or U, or a vowel produced from an O or U by umlaut. That's why you have English worm, Old Norse ormur, English word, Old Norse orð, English wolf, Old Norse ulfur, etc. So at one time, his name, Woðanas, did alliterate with the first element in the name of Valhall, which would have been something like Walhallu, perhaps, in Proto-Norse, the period when the Elder Futhark was being written. Now, the very fact that his name alliterates with Valhall at an earlier stage of the language than the stage in which Grímnismál is composed, and the fact that we very consistently see, for example, Njörður associated with Nóatún, makes me think that there's at least probably a few centuries of tradition about these names of places, and that there might once have been more of a tradition about what these different places were like. We only really get substantial details about Odin's Hall, Valhall. We get so little detail about some of the other places like Breidablik and Þrúðvangar and Himinbjörg, which are also associated with much less mentioned gods and goddesses anyway, that it's hard to know if there was ever very much about them, or even if they might not be the same place as some of these other places. I've wondered if Þrúðvangar, where Freyja is the mistress of the hall, isn't confusion for a different name of Valhall. But we have a little bit of tradition about Thor's Hall, a place whose name begins with Þrúð. Þrúðr is a feminine word for strength. It's also the name of one of Thor's daughters, at least if we can trust that Siv's daughter is also Thor's. And let me just give you a quick word from my friends and partners at Grimfrost, and I'll come back and say what Grimnismal and kind of residually Snorri Sturluson's Prose Edda says about Thor's home. So Þrúðr is a word much associated with Thor, and as I said, he probably has a daughter named Þrúðr. And Grimnismal tells us in stanza 4, Land heilagt ek liggja sé, osum og olvum nær. En í Þrúðheimi skal Thor vera, uns rjúvask regin. A land is holy, which I see lying, standing, being present near the gods and elves. And in Þrúðheimr, strength home, Thor shall be until the gods are broken, till Ragnarok. There's not a whole lot here. It is interesting to see that it is called near where the gods and elves are. Of course, it's not very easy to tell what the map of the Norse mythic cosmos ought to look like, right? If you search Google Images or something, you'll find all kinds of representations of the Norse mythic cosmos. Often they really overemphasize Yggdrasil, and very many of them make the different realms like Asgard, the enclosure of the gods. Remember that Garðr means an enclosure, not unlike the old corral that I'm in here, right? It's a fenced-in area around homes. Not a planet, and obviously the Norse didn't even have a conception of planet. But these modern maps and images tend to make these places like Asgard, Midgard, the middle enclosure where we live, look like separate sort of, quote, planets from one another. Whereas where these places are in relation to one another in the Eddas is extremely unclear. Now, that may seem difficult to buy sometimes. Wasn't there a clear picture? And I would say, no, you don't really need that clear of a picture to tell stories about these places, or even about people going back and forth between them, right? Draw me a map of the events of GoldenEye or any other James Bond movie, right? Draw me a map of exactly where things happen in a comic book or other, or popular novel, or just about any movie. It's actually fairly seldom that movies or even novels have clear maps that you can follow that are included with them. The Lord of the Rings, I guess, is an exception in books. Indiana Jones is an exception in movies. But, watch the Lord of the Rings movies and draw a map for me of where all these things are without looking at the book, and I'm sure you'll be pretty lost. It's the same with the Eddas, right? They don't necessarily have a clear map in their heads of where all these places are. Probably different people envision it different ways. And by the way, we don't even have any surviving maps from Old Norse times. We don't even know what their maps would necessarily look like. But we have Thor living in, again, strength home, Þrúðheimr. Now, Snorri, when he just paraphrases this part of Grimnismal in his Prose Edda, and that's so often what he's doing in the Prose Edda, right? He'll repeat the exact same thing that's in some poem that we know from the Poetic Edda, or he'll just barely paraphrase it like a high schooler, trying to pass off a Wikipedia article in a paper. He doesn't count as a separate source, but it is interesting that he calls this Þrúðvangar, right, like strength planes, rather than Þrúðheimr. That suggests Well, it's one of the many little bits of evidence that we have that Snorri learned the poems of the Poetic Edda from a different written, or more likely oral tradition, than the one that produced the Codex Regius manuscript of the Poetic Edda. But it also suggests just maybe there's enough mentions out there that we don't have, that there's probably other traditional poems where this place was mentioned and it was called Þrúðvangar instead of Þrúðheimr, or just alternate versions of Grímnismál where that was true. Now, continuing Grímnismál, we see in stanza 23, Odin says that Valhall, his hall, has 500 dura och fjórum tugum, 500 of doors and 40. Now, the way numbers are handled in archaic Old Norse, it's actually hard to know if this is 5 times 100 or 5 times 120. In the most archaic Norse texts, hundrað means 120. And also in more archaic texts, we often see it used with the genitive of the noun that's described, right? You don't say 500 doors, you say 500 of doors, like what's said here. So hard to know which number we would represent this as. But then in stanza 24, we hear about Þrúðheimr, where, I'll just read you the stanza. We've got 500 golva och fjórum tugum, svo hugek Bilskirnir med bugum. Rana þeirra erik réttvita, means vetek mest magar. So I think Bilskirnir, which Snorri says is the hall of Thor inside his home realm of Þrúðvangar. So Þrúðvangar or Þrúðheimr would be like the plane that I'm standing on here, but then the hall, probably less dilapidated than these, would be, like the house. It'd be like Bilskirnir. So I think that Bilskirnir has 500, potentially actually meaning 5 times 120, and 40 doors with all its corners. Of those houses, which I may know to be roofed, I know my sons to be the biggest. So he's saying that Bilskirnir, the house in Þrúðvangar, Þrúðheimr, is the biggest house there is. Now, what does Bilskirnir mean? A little bit hard to say. The length marks that we put on vowels, those acute accents, are a phenomenon of modern Icelandic and of modern scholarship. They're not there in the manuscripts. So if this is a short I, Skirnir could be the preventer or refrainer. If it's a long I, Skirnir could be the shiner. That's also the name of the messenger of the god Freyr. The Bill part could be from Bill a shake, it could be from Bill a short time. So, maybe the most plausible explanation is that it's the place that prevents from shaking, like it's a place that doesn't ever tremble, maybe reflecting something about Thor himself, who never trembles. I think about the tradition in the poem Atlakvida, that's also in the Saga of the Volsungs, where Gunnar knows that the heart that he sees on the plate before him is not his brother Hogni's, because Hogni's so brave that his heart never shook in his chest, and it certainly wouldn't shake on the plate. But hard to say what exactly we should be taking this as the only place this is mentioned is this stanza of Grímnismál, and then we get the very bare clarificatory remarks from Snorri in his prose Edda, where Snorri says, just to give you the exact quote, Han, meaning Thor, he, O Thariki Þrúðvangar heita, en hol hans heitir Bilskirnir. So Thor owns there, meaning in Asgard, the general larger realm of the gods, a kingdom called Þrúðvangar, Strength Plains, and his hall is named Bilskirnir. Again, Snorri is not giving us details that I'm holding back from you, right? I think sometimes people think that I'm holding back all this secret lore. The fact is, most of the serious study of Norse mythology is making do with the little drops of lore that we get, because there's no big river of lore that I'm hiding from you. Is Thor's realm or hall an afterlife? One of the few hints at that is in Horbar's the poem where Odin and Thor insult each other, where in stanza 24, Odin says, this is part of what he says in stanza 24, Odin o Jarla tho eri Valfalla, and Thor o Thradakyn. Odin owns the Jarls, the noblemen, right, the men of high status who fall in battle, and Thor owns the men of slave families. So we have Odin insulting Thor for being associated with lower classes. We also see that when Thor and Odin exchange curses and blessings on Starkadr in seen in Gatrek Saga that I translated in The Wanderer's Havamal. This could just be Odin trying to insult Thor by his association with those lower classes. There may not actually be old lore that provided for men of low classes going to Thor in their afterlife. We don't see any mention of that anywhere else whatsoever other than in Horbar's the Oath. So I tend not to think that if that was a belief, that it was a widespread belief that men of low class or status who fell in battle would go to Thor instead of to Odin. Or Freya, if you take the Þrúðvangar stuff at face value the way that it usually is. But 19th, 20th, 21st century interpreters. Now, I'm a big proponent of taking the Eddas as close to face value as can be. I think that, whoever composed these poems 1,000 or even more years ago knew better than we do what was meant there, and that we oughtn't to be searching for. Things like allegory. I don't think that that's really what these poems are about, but I do think that we have to keep in mind that there's so many different traditions probably floating around, both in time, right, over the centuries from the beginning of the Viking Age to the time that the Eddas are written down, and in place, right, from Iceland and Greenland over to Denmark and Sweden, that we have to remember that the Eddas may contradict one another, and that what's hinted at in one place is not necessarily something that was widely believed, right? It's hard to know whether the dominant name for Thor's home might have been Þrúðheimr, as we see in Grínismál, or Þrúðvangar, as we see in Snorri's Prose Edda. Just the same, it's hard to know whether a comment like Odin's about dead men of low status going to Thor after death might just be him trying to insult Thor, and we are just sort of missing the sarcasm there 1,000 years later. But that's what, again, the serious study of Norse mythology is like. It's about trying to make do with the drops of information we get, because we're not going to find a river. Well, I've told you what I can tell you, what I know about Thor's home. Of course, I stand here in what I guess you could say is basically my dream home, and it is my Patreon supporters who make such things seem closer to my grasp, although this is National Forest, so this isn't specifically within my grasp. Thank you, Patreon, for continuing to allow me to make a living from teaching, even in my post-university career, and everyone out there from one of my favorite spots, high up in beautiful Wyoming. Let me wish you all the very best.